In this episode, we begin with a simple but very important question that sits underneath many security decisions. How should a system decide who gets access to what? New learners often hear about usernames, passwords, badges, permissions, and administrator rights, but those are only the visible parts of a much deeper control idea. Behind every good access decision is a model, which is the logic used to decide whether a person, process, or device should be allowed to read, change, create, approve, or delete something. That logic matters because security gets weak very quickly when access grows through random exceptions instead of a clear and consistent method. If an organization does not understand its access control model, it may hand out permissions in ways that feel convenient at first but become confusing, risky, and difficult to review later. Evaluating access control models means learning how different approaches make decisions, where they fit best, and how to choose in a way that matches real work instead of chasing the most impressive-sounding idea. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.News in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At a basic level, an access control model is a way of organizing authorization decisions after identity has already been established. In identity and access management, IAM, authentication answers who or what is trying to connect, while authorization answers what that identity is allowed to do once recognized. That difference is important because a perfectly verified identity can still have the wrong access if the control logic behind authorization is weak. Most access decisions involve a subject, such as a user or service account, an object, such as a file, record, application, or system, and an action, such as viewing, editing, approving, or deleting. A model provides the rules or logic used to connect those three things in a consistent way. Without a model, permissions tend to pile up in an improvised way that makes sense only to the person who granted them at the time. A good model brings order, predictability, and reviewability to decisions that would otherwise become messy and hard to defend. Realistic logical control choices matter because no single model is perfect for every environment. A small team sharing ordinary business documents does not need the same access logic as a defense organization protecting highly sensitive classified data. A cloud-based business with fast-changing roles, remote workers, and many software services may need more flexible control than a stable environment where duties rarely change. That is why beginners should be cautious about looking for one universally superior model. The best choice is not always the most detailed or the most restrictive. The best choice is the one that fits the sensitivity of the data, the complexity of the organization, the rate of change in roles and systems, and the ability of real people to manage it correctly over time. Security logic must be strong, but it must also be understandable and sustainable. A model that looks elegant in theory can fail badly if the organization cannot keep it accurate, explain it clearly, or apply it consistently as people and technology keep changing. One of the oldest and easiest models to understand is discretionary access control, DAC. In this model, the owner of a resource or someone acting with similar authority can decide who else gets access to it. That means the ability to grant access is somewhat discretionary, or based on the judgment of the person who controls the object. This approach is common in many everyday computing environments because it feels natural and flexible. If you create a file, folder, or document, you may also decide who can open it, edit it, or share it further. The strength of DAC is convenience and speed because access can be adjusted quickly without a large centralized process. The weakness is that control can become inconsistent and difficult to govern at scale. Different owners may apply very different standards, and people can accidentally grant broad access without realizing the risk. DAC works best in lower risk or more collaborative situations, but it becomes harder to trust when information sensitivity rises and the organization needs stronger uniform control. A very different model is mandatory access control, MAC, which is built around centrally defined classifications and strict policy rules rather than the preferences of individual users. In this approach, access depends on labels or sensitivity levels assigned to users, data, or systems, and individuals usually cannot override those rules just because they own a file or manage a project. The main benefit of MAC is strong consistency. When information must be handled according to formal security categories, the model helps ensure that access follows those categories rather than personal choice. This makes MAC especially valuable in environments where sensitivity is high and policy must remain rigid, such as national security or similarly strict regulated settings. The trade-off is reduced flexibility. It can be harder to adapt quickly when business needs shift, and it often requires careful classification discipline to work well. For beginners, the key lesson is that MAC is powerful when data sensitivity drives the control decision, but it can feel heavy and restrictive in ordinary business situations where collaboration and rapid role change are more common. A model that many organizations rely on heavily is role-based access control, or BAC. In this approach, access is tied mainly to roles that represent functions such as help desk technician, payroll analyst, sales manager, or database administrator. Instead of granting permissions one by one to each user, the organization groups permissions into roles and then assigns people to the appropriate role or roles. The main strength of our BAC is simplicity and scalability. It is often much easier to manage access by job function than by maintaining long lists of individual permissions for every person separately. It also supports cleaner onboarding, easier review, and more consistent expectations when roles are designed well. The challenge is that real life is often messier than a neat role chart. People take on temporary duties, cross-functional work, and blended responsibilities that do not fit perfectly into one role. If roles are designed too broadly, they create excess access. If they are designed too narrowly, the role structure becomes difficult to maintain and starts collapsing under its own complexity. Another major model is attribute-based access control, ABAC, which makes decisions using characteristics about the user, the resource, the requested action, and the surrounding context. Those characteristics might include department, employment status, clearance level, project assignment, time of day, device condition, network location, or the sensitivity of the data being requested. The major advantage of ABAC is flexibility and precision. Instead of assuming that everyone in one role always needs the same access, the model can evaluate several conditions at once and make a more tailored decision. This can be especially useful in large, dynamic, or cloud-connected environments where business conditions change constantly and context matters. The trade-off is that ABAC can become harder to design, explain, and maintain. If too many attributes or conditions are used, the logic becomes difficult for managers, auditors, and even administrators to understand. Beginners should remember that ABAC can be very powerful, but power without clarity can create confusion, and confused access logic is rarely secure for long. Some environments also rely heavily on rule-driven control logic, where specific conditions help shape access decisions even if the broader model is role-based or attribute-based. These conditions may include whether access is being requested during business hours, whether the connection comes from an approved region, whether a device meets security requirements, or whether the transaction exceeds a certain risk threshold. This kind of control is especially useful because it recognizes that access is not only about who the user is, but also about the circumstances surrounding the request. A manager approved for one type of action in the office during normal operations may not be allowed to perform the same action from an untrusted device late at night through a risky path. Rule-driven logic makes security more responsive to real conditions. At the same time, it can add complexity if too many rules pile up without clear ownership or design discipline. The best use of rules is to strengthen meaningful boundaries, not to create a maze of exceptions that nobody fully understands. In real organizations, access control is often a hybrid rather than a pure textbook model. A company may use our BAC as the main structure for assigning everyday business access, while also applying ABAC-style conditions based on location, device health, project membership, or data sensitivity. It may use stronger MAC-style thinking for a narrow set of highly sensitive records while leaving most ordinary collaboration under a more flexible approach. That hybrid reality is important because beginners sometimes assume they must choose one model and reject all others. In practice, the real task is usually deciding what should be primary, what should be supplemental, and where the boundaries of each approach should apply. A human resources application, for example, might use job roles to assign basic access, device and network conditions to shape how access is allowed, and extra restrictions for records containing especially sensitive information. The environment still needs a clear logic, but the logic can combine more than one model if it remains understandable and well-governed. When evaluating which model fits a real environment, one of the first questions should be how stable the organization's roles and responsibilities actually are. If people mostly work within well-defined job functions and role boundaries stay consistent over time, our BAC may provide strong control with relatively manageable administration. If access depends heavily on changing context, shifting project teams, data labels, and environmental conditions, then a BAC or a hybrid may offer better precision. If the organization handles information that must follow strict classification rules regardless of individual preference, then MAC-style logic becomes more important. DAC may still have value in collaborative spaces where users need flexibility, but it becomes riskier when highly sensitive data is involved. The main point is that realistic choice begins with honest observation of how work actually happens. Access models fail when organizations pretend their operations are more orderly, stable, or simple than they really are, because the model then drifts away from daily reality almost immediately. Another major factor is how well the model supports review, auditing, and explanation. A model is not just good because it can deny risky access. It is also good when managers, system owners, auditors, and security teams can understand why access was granted or denied in the first place. Our BAC often performs well here because the logic can be explained in a straightforward way through job roles and known responsibilities. MAC can also be highly explainable when classification rules are clearly defined and consistently applied. ABAC can provide excellent precision, but if its conditions become too numerous or too hidden inside policy engines, the organization may struggle to explain decisions in plain language. That is a serious problem because security decisions must often be reviewed after incidents, policy questions, or audit findings. A model that nobody can explain clearly may still make technically sound decisions, but it becomes harder to trust, harder to challenge, and harder to improve when business needs evolve. Beginners should also watch out for several common misconceptions. One is the belief that the most granular model is always the best model. More detail is not always better if it creates so much complexity that people stop understanding or maintaining the logic. Another misconception is that direct user-by-user permissions are more flexible and therefore more practical than structured models. In reality, heavy reliance on direct permissions often leads to privilege drift, inconsistent approval, and painful access reviews later. A third misconception is that once a model is chosen, the organization's access problem is essentially solved. The truth is that any model still depends on clean identity data, thoughtful approvals, regular review, good deprovisioning, and clear ownership. The model shapes the logic, but it does not replace governance. Security is weakened when people treat an access model as a technical setting rather than as an ongoing control approach that must stay aligned with business reality. A few practical examples make the comparison easier to see. A school sharing general instructional materials might tolerate more DAC because teachers need flexibility to collaborate and the information is not uniformly sensitive. A hospital or financial institution may lean more heavily on structured or BAC because job functions strongly influence what information people should see, but it may also add contextual conditions to reduce risk in remote or unusual access situations. A government environment handling highly sensitive classified information may require MAC-style logic because central classification and need-to-know boundaries must outweigh individual convenience. A large cloud-based company with contractors, remote staff, and fast-changing projects may use a hybrid where roles provide a foundation and attributes refine access in a more dynamic way. These examples show that realistic choice depends less on trendiness and more on the nature of the data, the pace of change, the need for central control, and the organization's ability to maintain the logic accurately over time. The access model also affects the entire lifecycle of access, not just the moment a user first connects. A model should support clean onboarding, role changes, temporary assignments, periodic review, and deprovisioning when a person or system no longer needs access. If a model makes it easy to grant permissions, but very hard to remove or review them, it may create long-term risk even if the initial logic seemed sensible. RBAC can help with lifecycle management when roles are well designed, because people can be moved in and out of structured access groups more cleanly. ABAC can also support lifecycle control if the attributes remain accurate and trusted, since access can change as the underlying facts about the user or resource change. DAC often struggles more here, because control may spread across many individual owners with varying standards. A realistic evaluation should always ask how the model behaves over time, because yesterday's access decision becomes tomorrow's review problem if the logic is hard to maintain. By the end of this discussion, the most important lesson is that access control models are not just abstract theory for security textbooks. They are practical ways of deciding how authorization should work in environments that must balance safety, efficiency, clarity, and change. DAC offers flexibility, but can create inconsistency. MAC provides strong central control, but may be too rigid for many ordinary business environments. RBAC makes role-driven access easier to manage, while ABAC offers finer precision when context matters more. Real organizations often combine these ideas, but the goal should always be to choose logic that matches actual work, actual risk, and actual administrative capacity. A realistic logical control choice is not the most fashionable model or the most complex one. It is the one that the organization can explain, maintain, review, and trust as people, systems, and responsibilities continue to change.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.